For years, the world watched Crimea as a frozen, untouchable prize, annexed, fortified, and sanctified in Russian rhetoric. But wars are won not just by single storms, but by patient, multi-year campaigns. Ukraine's Phase 2 isn't a dash across the bridge. It's a long chess game. Degrade what Putin built, make occupation expensive and unattractive, open exit options, and wait. This is how a besieged peninsula becomes a bargaining chip, then a problem for the occupier. This is how De-Russification begins. Quick recap: why Phase 2 follows Phase 1, deny Russia sanctuary. Degrade air defenses and naval reach so Ukraine can operate in and above the Black Sea with far less risk. This forced Russian assets to withdraw and repeatedly cost Moscow hardware and money. Phase 2, convert attrition into political social collapse inside the occupied territory, meaning the de-Russification by pressure, economic pain, psychological signaling, and enabling population movement away from occupied territory. Ukraine Phase 2 operate on two complementary prongs. Bleed the occupation, make it repeatedly costly for Russia to defend and maintain Crimea. Each rebuild is a financial and logistical drain. Create a golden exit. Signal that civilian life in Crimea is insecure and give an obvious, intact route out, the Kerch connection, that pushes an occupier's imported population to reconsider staying, and over time can change demographics and reduce the political cover that the Kremlin relies on. How the attack? The mechanics. Step A. Precision economic hits. Ukraine prioritizes strikes on high-cost, high-repair value assets, radars, helicopters, support vessels, refineries, logistics hubs. HUR and Ukrainian units have repeatedly targeted mobile radar systems, NIBO variants, Podlet, and other sensors, blinding integrated air defenses so lower-cost drones and missiles can operate more safely. Those strikes do not only remove capability, they force Russia to choose between replacing expensive kit or diverting resource elsewhere. Step B. Pause and watch. Ukraine intentionally pauses after burst. Why? Because the rebuild costs money and Russia's priorities are competing. Moscow must either rebuild Crimea's defenses to reassure settlers and show strength, or spend resources on frontline combat elsewhere. Over time, this balance bleeds the occupier. Those pauses are part of the plan, not a lull. Step C. Repeat. More strikes, more rebuilds, continued strain. Each cycle depletes cash reserves and manufacturing capacity. Analysts have repeatedly flagged the economic pressure on Moscow. Even earlier in the occupation period, Russia spent billions subsidizing Crimea. Since 2022, the war is estimated to cost Russia very large sums daily, multiplying the pressure. Why the Kerch Bridge is not simply a target to be destroyed. Destroying the Kerch Bridge will be dramatic and possible with large warheads under the right circumstances, but Ukraine's strategy uses the bridge as a signaling instrument. Repeated strikes and threats make the bridge a psychological lever. If settlers and personnel think their getaway route could disappear, many will choose to leave earlier. Ukraine's approach: threaten, signal capability, but keep the escape lane credible so civilians and even some occupation workers have a route out. Over time, that encourages self-evacuation and erodes the demographic basis for occupation legitimacy. The Flamingo FP5 type missiles unveiled in 2025 and reported to be heavy warhead cruise missiles dramatically increase Ukraine's signaling power because their warhead sizes, reported 1,150 kilograms, 250 plus pounds in open sources, make clear that critical infrastructure like the bridge is within range of serious damage. That capability enhances psychological pressure even if not used to sever the bridge entirely. The naval dimension: how sea-based pressure reshapes Crimea's defenses. Ukraine's maritime campaign, drones at sea, long-range anti-ship missiles, and targeted strikes on support vessels has sharply eroded the Black Sea Fleet's forward posture in Crimea. Multiple credible open-source tallies show dozens of surface and auxiliary vessels lost or damaged since 2022, and Ukraine's uses of sea drones changed the calculus for basing ships in Sevastopol and nearby ports. Analysts observe significant redeployments of fleet elements away from Crimea after repeated attacks. This loss of forward naval cover increases the effectiveness of Ukraine's air-land strikes and tightens the stranglehold on supplies to the peninsula. Water, food and energy, the siege calculus. Crimea's utilities are fragile. Historically, the North Crimean Canal provided the bulk of the peninsula's freshwater. Studies and multiple reputable reports identify the canal as supplying upwards of 80 to 85% of Crimea's pre-2014 agricultural and municipal water needs in some estimates. Figures vary by source and year, but the canal has been the dominant source. Disruption or reduced flow from the canal, whether from infrastructure sabotage upstream, dams, reservoirs, or from Ukrainian control over Kherson waterworks, dramatically raises the cost of sustaining populations and military garrisons in Crimea. Reuters and other outlets have flagged the canal's centrality and its vulnerability. Food, agriculture, there was a heavily reliant on canal water for irrigation. Energy and fuel depends on supply lines that are vulnerable when shipping lanes and overland routes are threatened. When basics becomes expensive or scarce, civilian morale drops on the occupation, and the occupation becomes less tenable. Demographics and De-Russification, the soft strategic win. Russia attempted to Russify Crimea after 2014 by moving people and reshaping institutions. Official figures cited a net inflow of hundreds of thousands of Russian nationals in the years after annexation. For example, public Russian statistics and reporting around 2018 flagged about 247,000 Russians moving to Crimea between 2014 and 2018, and a large outflow of Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars in the opposite direction. Those moves created political and humanitarian complications for any Ukrainian attempt at a direct assault. But when occupation life becomes insecure, repeated strikes, dwindling services, rising costs, and the perception of being expendable, population change behavior. Ukraine is counting on a demographic response. People vote with their feet. If enough of the imported population leaves, Crimea's Russification phrase and the political cover put in claims for the annexation weakens. That's not a battlefield victory, it's a political and demographic one, and it's the kind of slow, irreversible gain that makes a final political settlement feasible. Economic leverage, how sanctions, target strikes, and opportunity costs add up. Beyond physical strikes, Ukraine's broader diplomatic and legal efforts to isolate Moscow increase the economic pain. Crimea requires subsidized and infrastructure investment to appear normal under Russian control, from federal transfers to state company investment. Independent analysis from think tanks and journalists since annexation documented multi-billion-dollar expenditures to sustain the region. In the 2014-2019 window, analysts followed subsidized and state investments in the order of tens of billions. Continued military pressure multiplies those costs. The Kremlin's option become pour more money to reinforce Crimea, draining other fronts, or accept a lower standard of living and increased departures. That's the squeeze. Diplomatic and legal layers beyond bombs and drones. Ukraine is pairing kinetic pressure with diplomatic pressure. Legal claims over seized assets, efforts to enforce sanctions on Crimean exports, and international campaigning to keep Crimea legally recognized as occupied Ukrainian territory. The cost of occupation rises when private investment dries up, insurance is unaffordable, and firms risk sanctions. Those non-kinetic levers lengthen the timeline and make the war for political legitimacy a global contest, not just a local one. This is the beyond military element. It converts battlefield attrition into a long-term diplomatic cost for Russia. Risks, caveats, and moral case. The plan is patient and crucially avoids the catastrophic humanitarian costs of a frontal assault. But it's not risk-free. Civilian suffering, squeezing utilities and supply lines risks civilian hardship. Ukraine must calibrate to avoid unlawful collective punishment and preserve moral and legal standing. Escalation. Moscow could escalate in response using long-range strikes beyond Crimea or aggressive measures on other fronts. Time. This approach requires time and political endurance. Democracies must hold public support for long, patient strategies. Ukraine balances these risks by signaling restraint, leaving the Kerch route credible, focusing on military targets and infrastructure tied directly to occupation capacity, and coupling military moves with humanitarian alternatives and exit options for civilians. The moral pivot is avoid mass casualties while making occupation unbearable over time. What a win looks like, practical end states. A practical Ukrainian victory for Crimea under this plan will look like this. significant outflow or erosion of the occupation population, reduced demographic justification, sustained denial of key military assets or redirection of Russian resources, i.e. Russia stops funding Crimea while reallocating scarce resources. International isolation making occupation politically and economically unsustainable. Legal cases, frozen assets, restricted trade. A post-conflict political pathway where Ukraine can assert sovereignty with less risk of an immediate violent collapse. This isn't a single punch, it's a sequence, and the advantage of this sequence is reversibility. Ukraine isn't burning bridges, literally or legally, that it will need later. Instead, it's making occupation increasingly unattractive to those who live there and expensive to those who pay its bills. Tactical takeaway: Ukraine's phase 2 is patient, surgical, and political. It weaponizes cost, economic, demographic, and reputational, and pairs it with clear military capability. The goal isn't immediate conquest, it's to make occupying Crimea a long-term liability for Moscow and an unattractive place to live for the people Russia moved there. Over time, if Ukraine sustains the pressure and the world sustains resolve, the peninsula could be reclaimed not by a single offensive, but by attrition and political realignment. If you want the maps, timelines, and the clip list that produced these episodes, including the part 1 of this project, drop a comment below. Smash subscribe, turn on notifications. Thanks for watching and see you next time.